Now here's what's interesting. We're talking about perceptions here, right? And the whole concept of perceptions is perceptions equal our fact. What we tend to see and what we perceive and the way we look at things becomes our truth. In fact, we look to confirm our perceptions sometimes. We seek that confirmation. That's where sort of that confirmation bias kicks in. And perceptions are created, once again, through my experiences. And if it's been a negative experience earlier in my life, it's most likely left me with what we call a negative emotional memory or a negative emotional marker. That as I'm facing some of these similar scenarios in the future, some of these more stressful situations that are related to some of my previous experiences, I am drawn back to that emotional marker and therefore drawn back to some of those perceptions. And if we're not careful, our perceptions start to drive our behavior. This is where we end up creating what is known as preferences, wrong objectives, right? I go after the wrong thing. I'm trying to achieve the wrong thing in that interaction. And more importantly, we close ourselves off to new information. What we're trying to do is move ourselves from a place of perception to perspective, right? So when we look at perceptions, perceptions are the way I look at the world. Perspective is looking at the world through another person's lens. And the more perspective we're starting to bring into these scenarios, the more effective we're going to be at navigating and managing some of these situations. And when it comes down to these emotional experiences and challenges and stresses, it's about adding information in order to give us opportunity to gain what we know as psychological mastery. Right? This is the world of the child. When I'm interacting and I'm dealing with certain individuals that might be operating as a child, it's not that they're interested or they're intentionally coming in as child, it's their lens and their perception and what they tend to be driven from. Your perceptions equal fact. It's the snake eating its own tail, right? We get that defensive sort of response. I get aggravated or irritated by that because there's an expectation that swings around pretty fast. The angry child, once I let it out, there is no calling that back. So it's like the gun. Once the bullet leaves, there is no calling it back. So I'm going to say, before I let this thing out the gate right now, let me make sure that I'm pointed in the right direction. Next thing is, what's my objective? And does my angry child serve in getting my objective? If so, let's go for it and let's go 100. But if it doesn't, the next question I got to ask myself is, what is contributing to my angry child and how do I now need to manage this moving forward? And how can I change the dynamic of the relationship or the situation in order to not feel this way, because I don't want to feel this way anymore. Simply put, there's a trigger event, sometimes self-imposed, sometimes imposed from others. Like we walk into the scenario, we get caught up in the interaction, and there's two things that happen. Normally, we revert right down to that child ego state that tends to operate with what we call I got hooked. That's where the angry child comes out, etc., etc. One of the things we know about this is there's space and there's a time between what comes out of their mouth, or that trigger event, versus what comes out of mine. So the question comes down to, how do we interject the process? And how do we sort of go this way? And this now begins with recognizing the trigger event itself, what is the actual hook, and now it's about processing through that information in order to get to that adult. So let's talk a little bit about our brains. We've got two brains. We could simply call it, from an ego state standpoint, the adult brain versus the child brain. Now, the amygdala, your child brain, your cave brain, has one responsibility, and that is self-preservation and survival. So what do you think happens when I call you in for a meeting and I want to have a conversation about your numbers? You talking to your crew, right? Like, hey, I want to talk to you about your response time type of thing. What are the chances of them coming into that meeting ready to defend, ready to convince, ready to rebut? Salespeople have the best stories on why they closed the deal, and they've got the best stories on why they didn't close the deal. They will sell you on both. This is where, in absence of that rite of passage, when I come to you and I say, hey, it's Thursday, can you and I get together tomorrow at 4 p.m.? What happens to your brain? Trouble. What did I do? I'm walking in here. This is going to be a bad meeting. I'm in trouble. We're getting ready, because guess what? In a lot of cases, if you're prepared for that letdown and that letdown happens, your own ego says, oh, I knew that was going to happen. That's why it's easier for us to focus on the negative than the positive, because when the negative happens, it's not so much of a letdown when I was expecting it. Versus if I focus on the positive and the negative happens, there's a greater letdown. But this becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy, law of attraction. What you focus on and what you're going after is what you end up creating. It's not so much about just being optimistic, it's about being futuristic sometimes. Where do I want to go with this stuff? How are we getting there? That's where the objective kicks in. But this is what we do in life, right? We survive. That's a joke about shark diving. you're South African. What do you need when you go shark diving? A cage, okay? And if you don't have a cage, you need a friend who's a little bit of a slower swimmer, okay? Now today we're not surviving the tiger and we're not surviving shark diving, all right? I'm surviving my reputation. I'm surviving my brand. I'm surviving from feeling that thing that I felt before. I'm surviving and I'm preserving from conflict. It's easier for me to not say something. It's easier for me to bite my tongue. It's easier for me to internalize my stuff. It's easier for me to walk in defensive and argumentative and attacking versus being open and responsive and receiving. Split-second reactions. You notice if you've ever had to jam your brakes on in the car, what's the first feeling you have afterwards? You're pissed off. You're yelling at the other driver. Fucking idiots, what the fuck is wrong with you? Right? There's no one in the car with you. But that split-second reaction, that survival brain is the same brain as your fight or your flight. Your angry child, your withdrawn child. There are 4 ways we tend to survive in today's world. Fight, could be physical, could be verbal. This is our marriages, right? What do we do in our marriage? We argue and we fight. Fight to be heard, fight to be understood, fight to get our needs met. How do we survive sometimes professionally? Through the flight. We withdraw, we become avoidant. I don't bring up the topic. I don't ask for help. I avoid the decision. The other way we now survive, so fight or flight, that's pretty obvious, right? The new sort of age of survival is 2. First is called fawning, which is I'm complimentary of you. So in order to avoid the conflict, I appeal to you through flattery and through compliments. We kind of do this with the positive sandwich. Hey, by the way, just want to let you know you're doing such a great job in this area, but there's a little bit of an issue here. But you're so fantastic being part of the team. It's confusing, right? And then the final way we're surviving right now is through flocking. And this is, we're adjusting ourselves to become part of the group norm. I change my opinion, I change my values, I change my beliefs, I switch my positioning in order to go along with everyone else. I become a zebra. I don't know where the lines start and where they end. So again, how do we survive today? We're not physically surviving through tigers, we're emotionally surviving. My reputation, my brand, my relationship, my conversation. It is easier for me in a lot of cases to avoid. And I believe the pandemic has also created a little bit of that issue as well, which is we've gotten so used to being isolating that we're not engaging. The challenge in today's world is that our amygdala, our survival brain, is like stuck on the on position. We are walking into our communications, into our management, into our scenarios, into our decisions, ready to fight or flight. Remember I said perceptions close us off to new information? If I walk in with the perception of X and I come into that interaction more defensive, I'm not even able to hear the information that's being presented to me. How much do we retain from what we hear? 20%. The rest of that is made up. We also understand that this brain needs to be consciously interrupted. In other words, all ego states are sort of automatic except the adult. The adult is the only ego state like a switch that needs to be turned on. The child ego states are always just engaged. Your parental ego states are just your natural unconscious way of communicating and behaving. Okay, so I want to introduce you to the STOP concept. The STOP concept is a framework to help us walk through and think through these scenarios. The emotions will always rush first, and the idea behind the stop in itself is being able to pause and catch the emotion. It's not about not feeling. The biggest mistake people make when it comes down to emotional intelligence is the belief of not feeling. I shouldn't feel this way. It's actually the opposite. The feeling comes first. Then what I do to process it comes after. The reason I'm going to introduce the stop is very simply because there's been a trigger event, and that leads to me being hooked. And the actual terminology here is I got hooked, not they hooked me. And when we say get hooked, what that means is you start out as the adult, and then you are slipping or hooked into the child. We all have a primary child. In other words, when we face the stress, there is the primary child that comes up. Mine's angry child, so beyond becoming mine's not so much defensive, mine becomes I fight and I argue with you, sometimes unconsciously. Now, in order to understand trigger events even more, let's understand triggers, and not the 2024 woke narrative triggered, which I'm triggered. The thing that happens that brings you back to the child. Now, we get triggered because of our beliefs, because of our values, because of our experiences. Right? I've told you about me on the plane. I get very hooked by the idiots with the 17 bags. Just check your fucking bag. I'm sorry. Check your bag. I'm sorry if you were one of these people, but I'm going to call you out. So I'm traveling here on Saturday. This is how perceptions work, right? And I see these two hippies, all right? And of course, you could tell. So they get, and I'm looking, I see them, and I beeline across them, and there's the one guy. Okay, he's got a massive mountain equipment co-op backpack, like he's about to mountaineer up the mountain. Massive backpack, all right? Definitely doesn't fit in the little bin. You know, they now make you put your bag in the bin. I don't know how you got past with that. And then a massive knapsack on the front looking like he's pregnant. Walking around, right? And I'm looking at these guys, boyfriend, girlfriend, fiancés, who knows? Like, look at these idiots getting on the plane. I get on the plane with my little backpack, all right? I know the rules. I understand all of this. Anyway, fast forward this conversation. Who sits next to me? The guy with the backpack. His name's Brad, by the way. Really nice guy. Really, on his way to Edmonton, getting a connector, didn't want to check his stuff. Well, I'm like, ooh, I'm glad I stopped and didn't say something, right? But we get driven really fast. It's about going, aha, there it is. Let me pause, the instinctive reaction. Now, if in the meeting, the instinct of feeling the heat under the collar, the frustration's kicking in, the defensiveness is kicking in, pause. If I'm in that meeting with the clients and I'm starting to back off in that withdrawn shot, just before backing off, before avoiding, before biting my tongue, just pause that. For me, I'm more overt, so the pause is quite visible. We stop talking, we stop reacting, we stop fighting, we stop pounding on the keyboard. Now, the idea behind this is you're catching yourself, because the three components of, or pillars of, emotional intelligence is number one, and this becomes, in this specific order, this is how we go through emotional management. Number one is self-awareness. What ego state has come up to engage right now? What are the reasons this ego state has come up? How do I want to move forward? Step two in emotional intelligence is what we call regulation. We're going to simply call it self-management. And the self-management is the regulating of the child ego state, or the emotion. Now, I can't emphasize this enough. It is not about not feeling. It is about bringing the temperature down. You've all been pissed off at one stage in your life? Yes. You've all been able to bring yourself down from that pissed offness? Yes. You've all been standing in line and you wanted to kill the person, but you went, oh, let me not do that. When someone said relax and chill out, you went, oh, yeah, shh. And you breathe, you exhaled a little bit, right? That is regulation. It's not that the temperature we don't feel, or the heat we don't feel, or the emotion we don't feel. It is now, what do I want to do with that? And one of the things, because we pushed this hard early in the program, the objective, we want to advance that a little bit to, can my objectives evolve, and can they maybe adjust in light of new information? So the answer to all of this isn't about ignoring it, it's about processing through it. It's about getting to some of the actionable things that I want to do afterwards, the decisions that I need to make, so we don't end up at 3 o'clock in the morning taking that scenario to bed with us.